My name's Guy Martin. I have work in the show that's called The Parallel State. It spans 8 to 9 years of work in Turkey from 2012 to about 2019, and essentially is a body of work that combines images from the hugely famous and successful Turkish soap operas and film sets and the real life drama and political violence on the streets of Turkey during kind of Erdogan's rise to power. And really the question of the work is what's really real? Is an image that you've seen of amazing protesters looking incredible real, or is it a very similar scene that's black mirrored on a Turkish soap opera set? So I kind of pose the question, is anything real in a kind of post-truth, post-Trump, post-Brexit world anymore? And that's what the work really addresses.
My name is Anastasia Taylor-Lind. I'm a photojournalist, and the work that I have in the show is an excerpt from a project called 5K from the Front Line. It's made in collaboration with Elisa Sopova, a Ukrainian writer and anthropologist, and follows the civilian experience of the same families and communities in the Donbas region of Ukraine over the last 6 years. Accompanying the photographs are 2 small sculptures of reproducing shards of shrapnel using silver that's been reclaimed from the photographic process. Pieces of shrapnel that have been found inside the homes of the people whose lives we've been documenting.
My name is Edmund Clark. I have work from 2 series in the exhibition here. I have one image from a series called Guantanamo, If the Light Goes Out, which was a body of work about the experience of Guantanamo Bay and the detention centres there and the experiences of the people who have been held there, which looks at that subject through 3 notions of the idea of personal space. So images from the detention cells where people are held at Guantanamo, images from the naval base where their captors live, and images from the homes where men who have been released from Guantanamo are living once they have got out. The second series is a project I made called Negative Publicity, Artifacts of Extraordinary Rendition, which I made with an investigative journalist called Crofton Black, which is looking at the CIA secret prison program and the extraordinary rendition process. And it's a kind of compilation, assemblage of photographs and documentation about that system, about who ran that system, who's responsible for the extrajudicial detention and transportation of individuals to be interrogated and tortured in secret prisons run by the CIA or run by other countries on our behalf.
My name's Simon Norfolk. The work showing here is 2/3 of the way through a couple of decades worth of engagement in Afghanistan. It's a kind of anti-war photography. When I was consuming a lot of war photographs and a lot of conflict photography from Afghanistan, I felt much more interested in the Afghan landscape itself that was never photographed by war photographers. All they photographed was the outside, helicopters and soldiers on patrol. And the landscape itself to me was something which was handcrafted by Afghan farmers. An Afghan farmer is a kind of hydraulic engineer in a kind of amateur way. And the way that they comb and craft the land and prepare it for a crop in a landscape which is basically a desert, but a hydraulic engineer can turn it into farmable land that a family can live from. So it was a way of a kind of very close focus on the landscape itself, the land itself, by putting a camera back in the same place 5 or 6 times over the course of a year or so, just to see how the land changes, how the time washes across the land. The project is called Time Taken, and it's about how time kind of washes through a landscape, because this landscape was there before the war happened. It was there all the way through the war whilst the war was taking place, but no one gave a damn, and it's what will be there afterwards. So it's a sort of longer exposure of that landscape, with the military just passing through as a sort of imperial wave. Afghanistan is a place that has seen wave after wave of imperial conquerors that just come and go, and they leave behind a kind of mess of wreckage, and then the next ones come along.
So human beings don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are, and photographers are human beings also.
I think authenticity is I think it's a really loaded term. I think that all of the work that is shown here is deeply personal to the photographers that have made the work, and then like the roles that we assign ourselves at the time that we're making that work. From images behind us that were largely made on an assignment for a magazine, to the work where our work is included, which comes from a different space. And so authentic for me was to kind of realise the time that I was making that work in, and to make, or an attempt to make, a body of work that essentially asked that question, is like, what's really authentic about that image? I'm not a Turkish photographer, so already a layer of authenticity in some people's eyes has been eroded away. But I think that I could authentically begin to question the role of me as an image maker and the role of the protester. And I think in any story, particularly a story around war, you always have to have heroes and villains. You have to have a good person, you have to have an underdog who you need to support, who you want to win, and you have to have the bad guys.
Do you mean in order for war itself to happen, or in order to tell a war story about a war?
I think for war to maintain itself, to maintain its publicity, to maintain its oxygen, it needs constant narratives, not unlike a soap opera or movie sets. These things need narratives. Simon was saying about the waves of people that have come through and passed through Afghanistan. These are waves of narratives. And I think, for me, that was a really important thing to kind of recognise, was that my voice wasn't the only voice, it was just one. But if I could kind of communicate in some way about the inherent trickiness of authenticity in conflict or social unrest, that in itself is a pertinent question that was made, I think, during this body of work, and it's definitely a question in 2024 as well.
Well, I think that's very true, and I think probably a good example is the war in Sudan, which doesn't have any narrative.
No.
Doesn't seem to make any sense to us. It's not covered. I don't really know who's fighting or why. And the war in Ukraine, which is drowning us. So I think that idea of that kind of contextual thing is really important. And without that, and I suppose and my photography, I think, probably the same in that it comes. I'm not somebody that's down on war photography. I think war photography is fantastic. I think war photography is it's incredibly courageous stuff. But I just find that's what is it that gets the attention? What is it that sucks up the focus? Is where the real problem is, because then it's a problem about policy. There's more people who died in Sudan than are dying in Ukraine, and yet it never appears in the papers. Why is that? Why is that focus so selective and so greedy? That's the thing that bothers me more. No one wants to photograph this, everyone wants to photograph that. And that could be to do with access. Some things are easy to get to and some things aren't. Sudan's a really difficult country to work in. But it's also to do with foreign policy, it's to do with the agendas that are set by governments. The Ukraine is a really good war for Britain to get involved in. Suits all of our foreign policy buttons, get ticked by it. Sudan doesn't. It's those other issues around it that I think are more interesting, in terms of what gets photographed, what doesn't.
I think authenticity is a very intangible thing. I think authenticity partly depends on the motivation and the intention of the person who's creating the work as much as what they're looking at. I think when I make work, what is very important for me is how I think an audience has seen this work represented, what they may know about it, how they have experienced it. Because often what I'm trying to do is to change that, or in some way impact and alter that form of perception. A lot of the subjects I work with are also subjects which are not very represented at all or unseen. I'm looking at processes which have not been represented. So there isn't really a single sort of authenticity, I feel, which exists around the subjects I deal with. I think there are so many different ways in which you could ascribe authenticity to the subjects that we're looking at from the perspectives of who's making them, who's the events, who's running the events, who's involved in the events, who are the protagonists, who are the victims, how do we define the victims, who are we to look at it, why are we looking at it, who are we looking at it for. Those are all different forms of authenticity or truth, if that's the word you're looking for. But I think it always comes back from the creative perspective of what's your intention.
Well, photography can present us with facts, but facts in themselves aren't truth, are they? So I think that's where the role of actually the photographer comes in, like the storyteller. We're not just talking about photographs, single frames, but like how you tell a story using pictures. So for me, that's part of that shift from facts to, truth is a very grand word. What would be more appropriate would be
Record?
yeah, there you go.
I think photography at its primary function of recording half a second, 250th of a second, that is undeniable. That's what it does. It records a moment in history. It is a document of that time and that place. But beyond the chemical and the science and the technology of photography, that for me is where truth, like, that's it. So what the person who took that picture, what the intention of that image maker was, except then with a human operating it, it will, from that moment, like, disappears down the rabbit hole of subjectiveness, and it stops being an objective document then. Apart from possibly X-ray photography, passport photos, Google image, those exceptions I think can be truthful. But the moment that a human...
But the machines are still built by humans.
But the machines are still built by humans. So it's a Pandora's box of it. But I think that as soon as there is a human interaction within the process of photography, truth stops then, and it becomes the photographer's intention or truth.
I think a photograph or photographs do provide an impression of truth. I mean, it is a digital or a chemical process, but I think that truth is entirely contingent on the context in which the photograph is presented, on what is going on in the mind of the person looking at the photograph, what they know about it, what they had for breakfast, you name it. I mean, I think I would draw a parallel with the idea of evidence in a court of law. You can have an object which might be described as evidence, but it only becomes evidence once a lawyer starts to articulate why it is relevant, what it is about this object which gives it presence and importance and significance. And I feel that's the same about photographs.
That's a really good analogy.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah.
Because it's just a crowbar until the lawyer says it's the murder weapon.
Yeah.
And the forensic scientist says, and it's got his fingerprints on it. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like I'm at the very end of my career, and I feel like I'm looking back on it. And I think my opinion about that definitely changed over the course of 25 years. I certainly feel that when I began, 2001 or something, when I started doing these kind of photographs, I went into it with a kind of rage, and I wanted to shove it in people's faces, and I wanted to make people who I felt were walking away from it come back and face it again. And I think increasingly as I get older, and maybe as I sort of drift away from photography a little bit, I look back and it feels like it never really achieved any of those things. And what I succeeded in doing was making, certainly Afghanistan, quite syrupy, quite chocolate boxy, quite absorbable, quite a commodity. You can buy a nice picture and you can put it on the wall. And I don't feel it ever really achieved the things that I really set out for. Now, you can't always judge what other people get out of the things that you stick on a wall. Their reading is their reading, and God knows some of the things that people come up with is pretty random. But I think particularly my work about about Afghanistan, which I was particularly interested in putting in front of an American audience, I think looking back more and more, it feels like I made it kind of consumable. in that way that the pictures were too pretty and too easy to kind of gloss past. And they never really had the kind of kick in the bollocks that I really wanted them to have. But that's a sour old man talking.
You can go.
I think I try, and I have, is responsibility the right word? I don't know, that's a very grand word. I think I try to bring some form of an alternative truth to the many truths about the subjects that I look at and that I'm trying to make work about. Maybe I would describe it as trying to affect the discourse around those subjects, to fill in something where the absence of accountability or the absence of process around the subjects that I look at, or in some way to alter the incredibly freighted, problematic, stereotypical representations about the people I am working with or the subjects I am looking at. Terrorism suspects who are held under a form of detention without trial in the United Kingdom, which overturns 800 years of the principle of habeas corpus. People who have been picked up as paid for with bounty money and then tortured and then released without trial. I mean, there's a complexity. I suppose that's what I think I'm doing. It's less a sense of responsibility to tell the truth, it's a responsibility to add complexity to the subjects which on our screens. So we have images and stories and narratives on our screens which present a form of truth, and actually behind those screens there is complexity to these subjects which reveal the systems of the power which is operating behind that. And I think that's what I have a responsibility to do, is to look at what's going on behind the screen.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. I think any kind of accountability or responsibility I have for truth-telling now is to acknowledge, to make work in the time that we live in 2024, where everything that we see is through a screen. I think I have a responsibility to try and find out what our digital selves reveal of who we are on the screen. I think moving forward that my accountability to truth is to acknowledge that everything goes through almost a virtual self. So any work that is made from me moving forward in some way has to recognise how meta the world is, and to try and import that into our lives. To ignore the screen, to ignore our digital lives, to ignore the presence of the internet in how we shape the stories that we do. I think that's the accountability that I have, is to at least recognise how complex and how virtual our lives have become. So I think that is for me that's a really key layer to add. And it may not look beautiful, it may look odd, it may look screen grabbed. I don't really mind. But the presence of our virtual selves online in conflict or in anything, I think that's a really essential layer that I want to try and incorporate into future work.
Yeah, it is. I'm a photojournalist. I've been working in Ukraine since the war started in 2014. Absolutely, it's the first thing that my job dictates, right? And I wouldn't be able to work as a photojournalist if I didn't feel responsible for telling the truth. But part of that, what did you call it? Tricky. What did you say? The truth. What was that thing?
Messy truth.
The tricky truth. The trickiness, right, of truth is trying to hold my biases somehow in my peripheral vision. And while I'm the photographer, I'm the one who would press the button on the camera to make the pictures that you see here. Alyssa Zopova is a co-author of them, in that everything that happened, everything that took us to that point, at the point where I was standing holding a camera, is because of the way we work together. And one of those really important elements is that Alyssa's from the community that we're representing. She's from Donetsk city, which has been occupied since 2014. And one of the questions we ask ourselves constantly about the photographs is, do the people in those photographs recognize themselves? So we're thinking not just about how people in other places, like here in the UK, might see people, but and we're not only making pictures for people here, right? We're making pictures for people's family photo albums, as well as for fancy locations like this.